Greetings, everyone, through here. Welcome to the Demo Hub. Welcome to another exciting episode. Today, we have a fascinating guest to talk to us about the product that allows you to chat with your data warehouse. Today, we have as a guest, Theo Totorishi. Theo is going to join us today to talk about Dot and what this means for revolutionizing how data teams interact with data and their data warehouse. Theo, welcome to the show.
Bro, very nice to meet you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited for a conversation today.
Awesome. Theo, where are you calling from?
So I'm Franco-Italian and I've been living in Berlin, Germany for the last 5 years. So today I call from Berlin.
From Berlin. That's awesome.
Mhm.
What is the weather like in Berlin this time of the year?
So today is very sunny, which is after the rough winter. It's
Mhm.
the happiness is back in the street basically.
Yeah, for us, it's spring and getting to the rainy weather, but I'll take this compared to the snow we've had the last couple of months. So, Theo, thank you for coming on board. I understand you're going to talk to us about Dot, a product you're
Mhm.
building to allow teams to chat with a data warehouse. Can you talk a little bit about what Dot is for the audience that have no idea what that is?
Absolutely. So in short, Dot is a chat agent that enables anyone in the organization to get an answer to their data questions in natural language. I can tell you a little bit about the history and how we ended up tackling this problem. My background in analytics was at a company in Berlin called Spryker System. I was the first hire in data, and I built basically the data team and data infrastructure from scratch. Stayed there for 3 years. We raised 180 million during my time there. The company basically did 7 or 8x during my tenure there. Got a lot of experience just tackling the traditional problems, right? Collecting data, building use case, finance, marketing, product sales, etc. And then I started my entrepreneur journey to try to solve some of the problems we had faced in data. And the first product we started with was called SLED. It was basically a data governance platform. And at the bottom of it, the idea was, how do we guarantee every data consumer that they can find, understand, and trust the data they need to take decision? So we operated SLED for a couple of years. And for us, the release of the ChatGPT models by OpenAI really rang a paradigm shift in data. Here for us, the idea was simple. How can we leverage the experience we have in governance, build a trusted system that enable people to leverage machines to get the insights that they need to drive their business forward? And so right now, that's what we chose to focus on. We're building Dot.
That sounds
Mhm.
fascinating to me. Can you touch a little bit about the name Dot? Is that an acronym for something? Always curious about the names behind products like what you have.
So the company name is called SLED, and Dot is the latest product. And the idea behind Dot is the data bot. So it's basically just shortening data bot. That's
Oh,
it.
so data bot Dot. Wow, pretty cool. I couldn't have thought about that, but now it makes sense. So that's awesome. How do users access this? Is this a SaaS-based application then? Is this something that teams have to install on-prem? What is the
Mhm.
delivery model?
Very good question. So Dot presents itself in two separate interface. One of them is basically a web application, so traditional SaaS. And here you have the conversational experience with your data warehouse and data infrastructure. You have a second piece of the product that we call the training space, which is a space where you can basically define what does Dot know and where Dot can know what exactly is your business model, what data you should have access to, what are the definition, the metrics that have been formalized. And then you have the experience. So that's for the experience for the data team. And then you have an experience for business stakeholders, basically can access and interact with Dot via Slack bot on Slack channel.
Okay, if I'm reading this right, you have the development experience where data teams, data engineers are telling Dot what to get trained on, pointing to the right semantic layer, and then the front end experience where average analyst coming in with NLP gets to interact with Dot based on what the data team
Mhm.
trained on. Is that a fair way to read this?
Sure. And it's even more than the average analyst. It's basically your every operator in the business. So here, as long as you can think analytically about your own performance and the work you have, you can basically interact in that in plain English or Spanish or whatever language you speak. You can interact with your data infrastructure, asking questions, getting basically metrics back, charts back, data sets back based on the question you asked the chat.
Okay. That's awesome. Got lots of questions to unpack, but let's go through the demo. We're going to be surfacing some of those questions. There's nothing more fascinating than actually seeing the product live. Let's jump into the demo.
Absolutely. Maybe I could give a couple of high level perspective just to frame the demo in the right way and then jump into it. The goal that many data teams try to achieve is this idea of self-service. So in order for the business to improve its performance, people in the business need to become data driven. And what the data team ends up doing, or at least what we see a lot of teams doing, is basically building accurate, trustworthy data products. So they can, for example, build certain dashboards that will be used by a different decision maker, and then giving access either to those data sets or to those dashboards, anyone in the business to play around with and find their own insights. So here, in order to enable self-service in an organization, we see really three important pillars. All data should be in the same place. That's the traditional data platform, Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift, etc. The data should be consistent and accurate. And that's all the work that is being done in governance. You mentioned semantic layer. That's basically defining a source of truth for metrics. That's basically documentation. What do your table means? What do your variable means? There can be example queries to carry a certain piece of analysis. And so all of that guarantee that if you want to get a specific answer for your organization, your business model, your specific process, you can, because there is knowledge about that. And then the last piece is data adoption. So what are the interfaces you give your data consumers to help them access those insights, derive those insights? And so the piece I'm going to show you today is the third pillar. How do we help with data adoption for people that maybe do not have the technical skills to either build dashboard or write SQL? And how do we guarantee that the results they get from the chat are consistent with all the governance practices that have been established in the company? Can you see the chat?
Yes.
Fantastic. It's very simple. You go to our website, Getdot.ai, and basically at the top right corner, you have a register section. And here you just create an account. You arrive on a panel that looks very similar to this. When you go into settings, basically we'll have an opportunity to connect to your data infrastructure, so to your data platform, Redshift, BigQuery, Snowflake, Postgres, etc. Here, if you can also basically sign a DPA or have access to all the legal documents around terms of service or privacy or security, and then you can get started.
I know you're going to maybe touch on this. Once you connect on the settings to your data warehouse, are you scanning the entire data warehouse then? Or is there an option to say, maybe I want Dot to be focused on the financial aspect of my data warehouse or the financial schemas, and you can train to that level of specificity? Or does it have to be the entire data warehouse?
Very good question. So what we do is basically we scan the entire data warehouse, and then we will surface what is it that we find inside this data warehouse. And here, but however, you will get to select what you give Dot access to in terms of tables, schemas, variables inside your table. All of this is you can define granularly. So at the end, we will find what data is available, but you decide as a user what you think Dot should get access to and what Dot can ask questions to.
Okay.
Good?
Very good.
Awesome. So for this demo, we basically have data related to the operations of an e-commerce business that sells ramen online. And so you can expect Dot to know and to be able to answer a question related to revenue, related to products, related to the performance of certain categories against others. And on the data side, you can expect basically tables like orders, customers, or order line items. Yeah. So let's imagine I'm a new joiner, and again, I'm operating on the business side, and I want to get to know the performance of the company. So one easy way to start would be by asking very very simple question around, for example, what are the top products? What are the top 5 sold products? So the moment I'm asking a question and I press enter, basically the dot agent is awaking and is doing basically 3 things. The first piece of the agent is what we call the attention models. And here, the idea is that the chat will go and look inside your data infrastructure. What are all the relevant data assets that can be leveraged to answer the question? And that means basically what tables should I use? What variables should I use? If you define metrics and they're relevant, that would be also a good input. If you've written down definition, either a variable or concept that are important for the business, all of this will basically be used. This gets structured and then passed on to a second component that we call basically the reasoning model. And what the reasoning models do is basically generate a SQL statement based on that metadata that is shared with OpenAI. And then the SQL statement is evaluated by a third component, which are basically evaluation models. And what they do is they verify that the SQL statement can be executed inside your environment, and that the answer basically matches or is consistent with the question that was asked. And so here, if we take a look, I'm asking basically what are the top 5 sold products. Product returns SQL statements. That's because we interact directly with Snowflake in that particular example. Then the code gets executed. We get an answer. We see both a chart and we can also see the data.
Really good. Is the attention, I think you mentioned the attention model, the reasoning model, and the evaluation model. Is the attention model specific to the user? So if I'm coming back and having this chat experience and this interaction, that over time you get to build that attention of what I as an analyst tend to ask and reuse that, or is it pretty generic with a broader scope than the user?
So here the attention is really based on the question you're asking.
Question.
The
Okay.
goal is to find an answer. And so here the question is, where is the signal? Out of all the things you're giving me access to, where can I find the most valuable piece of information to answer the question? So as I said, here it's about figuring out which table should be leveraged, which variable should be leveraged, and how should they be aggregated. So if you define, for example, a metrics that explains how to do this to answer this question, then we're going to leverage that metric to answer that question. Great. So here, really, the beauty of those conversational system is that you can have back and forth. So in that case, when I ask what are the top 5 sold products, the chat is basically making the hypothesis that the way to answer it is to leverage the viable quantity. But I could say, for example, great, what about terms of revenue? And here, when we're working inside a single thread, every question and answer we've received beforehand then become additional context to answer or tweak, answer this new question or tweak existing answers.
Which is very powerful. And I think that's why, ChatGPT, which most folks might be familiar with, became very popular because of that attention and the ability to keep track of context within the session. It sounds like you're bringing the same thing to.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so here, for example, you can see, so here, actually, I'm going to address this because that's a very interesting piece. So what I described, those three components, they're actually not just sequential. There will be iteration in the background depending on if the model managed in one shot to get a good answer, but sometimes the model won't, and we'll keep this iteration cycle between the attention, the reasoning, and then the evaluation, and then give a result. And in this case, the model basically found out that if I want revenue and not quantity to assess the most sold products, I probably would need to leverage the variable called total. And here you can see that the top product when it comes to revenue are actually not the same as the product when it comes to quantity sold. And in the same fashion, you can see either the chart or the underlying data.
This is powerful. As you go through this, I cannot help but ask the question about hallucination as you get these answers. How do you prevent, especially when you're getting bad results about sales and revenues that folks can end up making decisions on? We want to ensure data quality and trusting that data and trusting the result. How are you ensuring that with the responses you get from the large language model?
That's a great, great question. And that's really one of the most fundamental things we're working on with Dot. When you ask a question, you do not want any kind of answer. What you want is an answer that is specific to your business model, specific to your business. And so the most important thing for us is not to be another interface that the data team will give business stakeholder that will compete with things that they spend a lot of time getting right and getting clear and precise. Here, the goal is really to learn from what has been done. So what does it mean in terms of design for Dot? Dot needs to be conservative, which means when we ask, for example, what are the best 5 products in terms of margin? It's up to the chat to break down this question and really understand, do I have access to the data that helps me answer this question in that specific? And here, for example, the answer is just, we ask what are the top 5 products in terms of margin. The chat understand that there is no cost information related to the products, and therefore we can't calculate the margin. Here, it's even a special case where the chat will propose a proxy. So we cannot calculate best products in terms of margin, but maybe we can calculate best products in terms of something else. But it will explain explicitly what it's doing. So the answer to your question, which is how do you deal with hallucination, is twofold. Number one, making sure that those 3 components, attention, reasoning, and evaluation, are really aware of when I give an answer, how far is it from the question? And if that threshold of confidence is too low, the chat will just tell you, I do not have access to this data, or I cannot answer this data. So at a high level, the answer is by making the chat conservative. And one way to do this is to assess how far you are from source of truth or agreed definition for a specific question or a specific metric when giving an answer.
Okay, I think that's a reasonable approach, being conservative. And I love the chat experience because there's a thesis out there that part of the reason why ChatGPT is such a powerful or has seen the success it's seeing is not necessarily because the models are new. The GPT model has been around for a while with GPT-1, GPT-2, 3, 3.5, and 4. But that chat experience is a little bit novel. Chat has been around, but combining chat with the large language models seems to be something that people somehow embrace. Then bringing that to the world of enterprise analytics seems to be a little bit of a change of the guard in the sense that before you had your static reports where every morning you can, see your sales is pretty static on a formatted page and that's all you had. And then there are dashboards beyond that where you can somehow click on the slicer and have a little bit of interaction with the data. And it seems to me, and I want to get your thoughts on this, that we're kind of moving a little bit beyond just your reports and your dashboards into this new interface of interaction, of chatting. And that's where organizations are going. Is that how you read the tea leaves? Is that a fair way to look at it?
Absolutely. I think the reason why this chat experience is so powerful is because I think very naturally mimics what people are actually doing in organization. You are a marketing manager in charge of spending resources to get traffic to a website or to get leads. If you work in B2B, you're basically literally having this conversation with your data team or your data analyst. There is something to be said about the ability to understand a problem based on just progressing in this very natural question answer format. That being said, I also don't think that it's the end of static dashboard because there's also something to be said cognitively about seeing the same picture and the same graph every Monday, where after a while, it's just second nature. You understand the nature of the information that is being presented to you. You can detect shift of patterns on those charts. And so I think really here it's important to differentiate maybe different experience for a data consumer. One is basically, I have something that formalizes what is the performance of a certain process, right? You have input, you have output, and you can see that in one static dashboard. But then when you want to go deeper, right? When you have follow-up question, when you want to do deep dive, the conversational experience is very powerful and really is fit for this kind of exploration.
Yep.
And the second piece to this is, and here I've shown you this experience inside the UI. Later, I will show you how we translate to Slack. But if you're also able to give this experience directly in the tools you're using to communicate with other members in your team, then I think here you really have a new leverage to be productive. For the data team, that also means you can focus on building new data products that will help unlock a new insights about new pieces of the business, and let a chat that was trained rigorously to basically handle all the questions around simple KPI or slicing and dicing or following up on things that have been built up already.
Powerful. Theo, can you touch a little bit about security from this perspective? I'm sure that's a conversation you probably hear a
Sure,
lot with folks
sure.
wondering, I don't want my data going to
Yeah.
OpenAI or whatever model you use behind the scenes for the
Mm,
LLM piece of this. How are you approaching that to have folks who are thinking about
mm,
HIPAA, high trust, PCI, and all the PII type of concerns to
mhm.
feel comfortable that the
Yeah.
interaction with a chat experience like this is not going to expose them to leakages and other options like that?
Again, that's a critical question that usually comes very fast in the conversation we have with data leaders. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning two things. One is about the architecture of the chat agent, what exactly is being used in terms of data, what is being shared with companies like OpenAI. And then it's probably worth touching upon just the traditional policies and things you need to put in place to have a secure application that is compliant with a regulation framework. So I think maybe the simple place to start on the architecture of the chat agent is the way dot works is basically by so the data we extract from our consumers and the data that we share to tools like OpenAI are basically metadata. And so here the question is, are metadata sensitive enough for you to care, right? Here we share again definition, metrics, formula, we share table structure and variable names. We can share, if you accept it, of course, we can share things like unique values of your categorical variables. If you accept, we can share the data, but all of this is up to you. So I think that's the first part. You can get really good performance by sharing only metadata with OpenAI, and in return, they will give you something that you can execute in your environment. So I would say that's one. And then you have obviously granularity about the data you can share. You can decide what tables could be shared with. You can decide what, if you want to share the data or just, for example, calculation on top of the metadata. I mentioned unique values for categorical variables, for example. So this is at the level of the architecture. Then comes basically what does the data you share with OpenAI, where does it go and what does OpenAI do with it? And here, when you use the business API, what they say is basically they're not using the data for training, and they're also not storing the data or the guaranteed deletion after 30 days. So that's one more thing to take into consideration. And then it's basically the regulation and certification things. And here we're SOC 2 certified. So that's how we guarantee security of our application. And then we also enable, it's especially relevant for European customers, to basically sign a data protection addendum, right? Which contains both what are the policies that are being put in place in case of data breach, what are the security policies that are being put in place, what type of data is being transferred, and how are we compliant with GDPR regulations. So again, two things. One, architecture. How
Yep.
does the chat work? What data do we share or not share? And the second is just the traditional regulatory framework that is basically the same that you would have with any BI tool.
Okay, that's powerful. In your response, you mentioned two things that was illuminating to me. You said the business API for
Mhm.
OpenAI. So, and maybe this is just for lack of knowledge, OpenAI does have separate endpoints for the everyday users as
Absolutely.
opposed to teams that are building products on it. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And here the critical difference is that data is not being stored when it comes from the business API.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And not being used for training.
All right, very good. And thanks for that. You also mentioned performance, which is something pretty critical to with the adoption of a tool like that growing, that becomes a critical piece of organizational infrastructure. There is a link between your app and OpenAI. As always, you're as strong as the weakest link in the chain. If that link is broken for whatever reason, network connectivity, OpenAI goes out of business, probably will not go out of business. But how do you ensure that there is business continuity for teams that get to rely on this? Do you persist some of those embeddings so that the teams can continue using the app without necessarily having to go back and ping OpenAI all the time? Touch a little bit about that as much as you can.
So again, that's a great question. I think there's multiple pieces there to answer your question properly. The first piece is yes, today, if OpenAI closes shop or does not allow access to API, that will not work anymore. We will have to find basically other solutions, either using other large language models by other providers, or maybe even starting testing with open source solution or fine tuning our own models. All of those are things we consider, I think, later down the line. The second piece to answer your question about performance is yes, today the performance of the chat is very strongly related to OpenAI in the sense that we've seen, again, gigantic improvements from GPT-3 to GPT-4 or GPT 3.5 to GPT-4. That's one. Also, like the amount of tokens or context you can give the models after the upgrade was significantly higher. And so all of this, as OpenAI matures and how, as those large language models become more and more sophisticated, the solution that you can build on top will also grow with the tool. For us, specifically what it means, again, because performance is not just about the complexity of the SQL that can be generated, but also the accuracy. For us, there is a second piece of developing that product that is really important is, as I mentioned, the training space, right? What are the governance practices that you've put in place to make sure that you will get consistent answers from the chat?
Okay, powerful. Before we talk about the different interfaces that are available beyond, coming to the website, I know you have Slack
Yeah.
and before that, can you touch a little bit about pricing and
Yes.
for a decision maker looking at this and saying, my team, we have X amount of developers, X amount of engineers, and thousands of a user base that all are hungry for data and insights. And we want to adopt a tool like this. There is typically your consumption base, there is a SaaS base, seat base. How are you delivering this or thinking about it for organizations that might be looking at bringing this into the teams?
So your intuition is correct. I think there's two possibilities, and here, to be honest, it's still quite flexible. You have basically the consumption based route, even though I think especially in this economic environment, people are maybe a little bit more reluctant to, on the consumer side, I mean, to go with a usage based pricing. I think the place we're going to start with is basically a price per seat. And here, the idea is to give that data consumer experience from a Slack channel for a symbolic price per month per seat to really give access to the chat to as many people as possible in the organization. And then there will be probably a license price a little more expensive for the trainers, right? For the data team members that can basically operate the inner nuts and bolts of the application, right? Defining what can the chat have access to, what are the definition of things, what can be, for example, source of truth for certain questions or metrics, etc.
Okay. And do you see a particular industry that is more receptive to a chat experience more so than others? I'm guessing the answer is no, but just kind of curious from your vantage point, say in the e-commerce or the startups are more receptive to this versus, maybe a doctor at the hospital, treating patients, trying to triage them and just wants to put in a chat and get results back. Or you could be looking at manufacturing or retail, CPG. Are you seeing any industry really leaning more to the chat experience more so than others? And if not, it's okay.
So I think eventually everyone will have this kind of experience with their data. I think today the early adopters will probably be people in industries where industries that are extremely competitive, fintech, e-commerce, where basically access to quality data to as many people as possible drive those additional operational efficiency points in the organization.
Very good. And then you mentioned Slack, which is very fascinating to have that as
Mhm.
part of the UI interface, because
Mhm.
essentially you're meeting
Yeah.
users where they are. Not every
Mhm.
user is going to want to log into a site to have that chat
Mhm.
conversations. Conversations are already happening in Slack. It's where people are congregating these days. So can you talk about that and maybe showcase what the Dot provides from
Absolutely.
that perspective?
Absolutely. So you're absolutely correct. Nowadays, there's a tool for everything. And so if we can basically bring new capabilities to an interface that people are used to, I think that already can provide value. And very simply, for data teams that operate with Slack channel, where you can ask things to the data team, that's basically already basically using this interface. So let's look at what it would look like here. We can ask Dot how much revenue have we generated each month last year. Yeah. Here, very similar, right? Basically, the same components of Dots are being triggered sequentially. So first attention, then reasoning, and answer, which basically gets shown as a thread. Yeah. So here, immediately we lead with the chart, and you can both download the SQL if you want to rework it, or verify it, or even download the data as CSV. And so here, maybe that's a good place to look at series of questions that would be relatively common in many businesses. So the first thing is to understand at a high level how much revenue I've been generating. And then here I see a chart, but maybe I'm interested in a trend actually. So I could say something like, great, but how has overall revenue grown in percentage in the last two? So I have this high level overview of this chart. And now I want to get, okay, is there a trend? Is there a quantifiable trend behind this chart? As you can see, in less than 20 seconds, the tool is basically able to generate quite sophisticated SQL statements with multiple CTEs and leads with the result. The revenue growth is basically 16%. And here, again, the natural, if you're operating a business with varied product line, the next step basically be understand if that trend is homogeneous over all the different product categories. And so you can say something like, great, can you split this by product category?
While that's coming, the
Mhm.
chatting experience there, I'm guessing that this is not, it's not pulling some existing chat that was created and surfacing that to you. It's actually getting the data and visualizing that in real time for the user.
Yes, absolutely. However, here again, because you can decide to define, for example, your metric revenue, the chat will leverage definition and formalization of metrics that you've used before. So that's the beauty here. It's combining the flexibility of those large language model to governance that was formalized inside a data catalog, inside a semantic layer. So here, to keep going with that example, we see that there is overall a 16% revenue growth, and we can see that this is absolutely not homogeneous across the different product categories that make up that revenue. Some categories are increasing a lot more, and some decreasing a lot more.
Okay, powerful. Stepping back a little bit and
Mhm.
maybe looking at a big picture perspective on the tool, what is the North Star here as this large language model
Mhm.
seeps and permeates into organizations? What are you predicting would happen from a vision perspective, touching on the industry as well
Mhm.
as your vision with the tool?
That's a great question. So today, what we're doing is basically as SLED or the Dot organization is, we're breaking down the entire analytics value chain, and we're trying to figure out what are all the places where people will benefit from injecting large language model capabilities, right? Today, we start to focus with what we believe is the most important data adoption in the company, right? It's generally the first step when you build a data infrastructure. It's immediately you pull data from an API, you have raw data, you plug a BI tool, and you're already showing a chart, right? That's the
Mhm.
most important thing. And then as your need in analytics mature, then now it's time to have more stricter processes and transform this data. And here it's clear that large language model will be used at every piece of that value chain. They will be used to enhance the productivity of analytics engineer that will develop pipelines. They will be used by data analysts to generate maybe metrics inside your semantic layer in the future, right? Again, in a world where so many companies are VC backed, yes, every company is different, but you have huge repeatability across business model. And so every builders will benefit, I believe, immensely from those generative AI capabilities in building pipelines, building reports, building metrics. So that's how we think about it in terms of how is the technology going to improve data as an ecosystem. I think that's one aspect. And then there is what I believe will be eventually the end game. I think the end game will be probably operators of companies will have probably one AI per company that knows everything inside your company, the data inside your operational system, the data inside your data warehouse that knows how you're analyzing performance, and that is able to break down, to basically reason alongside decision makers about what is the business experiencing, right? What is the actual performance today? For example, do we have a good ROI on marketing investment? And here the AI will basically orchestrate a whole bunch of models that tackle well-bounded problems. So for example, if tomorrow I'm asking you, how would you like to grow your channel? Then it's that every piece to answer that question could be tackled with specifically trained AI. One piece will be to understand what are the levers. One piece will be to analyze and give analytical answer about all those different levers, then feeding the data back to another AI that will basically do a summary of that insight and make recommendation. And then maybe in the future, code will also be executed. New channel will be created with different parameters. And hopefully this is how our progress or improvement will happen in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a very compelling response there, Theo. Like you said, what I also see here, just to double click on what you said, is you seem to, with this interface, have insight, not just to answer the questions that people are asking, but you have insight into the questions that people are actually asking. Because you have all of that metadata. People are asking about revenue that much, right? I have 10 people asked about revenue in the last 3 days. Now, that insight could be used to then inform the teams that go build a dashboard about revenue. Whereas in the past, we could think that we need information about revenue or understanding how the sales channels are performing, but people don't have a way to enter that into a chat box. But you have the ability to capture that from your chat box, and that information is almost gold, right? Then you can recommend what questions people should be asking based on what everyone in the organization is asking. I think there is a gold mine there that could be very powerful.
And to be honest, this is already what good analysts are doing. When a business stakeholder comes with maybe somehow of an undefined problem or a question that seems a little vague, that's how the process starts, right? Formalizing, okay, what is exactly the question you're actually asking? What is that process you're trying to understand, or that process you're trying to explain? And then the first job of a good analyst is generally translation. So you came with me with a question, which is, are we generating enough leads, for example? Are our marketing channel performing to, well, actually, this is the framework we've defined for good performance. And this is the data that we collect. So actual question we can answer, for example, is if you understand performance with return on investment, and return on investment is amount of revenue generated by amount of spend in distribution channel, then this is actually what the question should be, and this is what the answer is.
Okay, very good. And this is not a trick question. Do you think SQL will be around, and how relevant will it be 10 years from now?
That's also a great question. And here, to be honest, I have some intuition. That's actually something we discussed with Rick, one of my co-founders. We're a team of three, Rick, Sven, and myself. With Rick the other day, we were discussing, for him, there is basically, so if you look at the history of computer science and basically higher abstracted languages, we've been doing that for the past decades, right? Which is At the beginning, we had basically assembly language and all those low-level programming language. And then little by little, we have higher and higher level of abstraction. And to a certain extent, I believe that large language models are basically this last step. The highest level language you can use to interact with the computer is actually your native language. And so to answer your question, I think it's really it. There will be probably many use cases where English is enough and you will not need to learn SQL for a lot of things. But again, if you're trying to rebuild an existing system or improve a system, then maybe obviously you will need that first-hand knowledge of how to communicate with a database using SQL.
Always fascinating to see how this is all going to play out. I think it's a fascinating space, and you and the team with Dot are dead center into the middle, innovating on this. Really glad to have you. Best of luck to you and the team. For the users that have followed through this conversation and are curious about testing this out beyond just the demo, they want to go and test it and play with it. How can they find or get access to Dot or connect with you, Theo and Rick and the rest of the team?
Wonderful. So you can find it. The website is basically Getdot.ai, which is written next to my name. There you can learn more about the products. You can contact the team. You can register for a free demo of the product and learn more about how we're building things. You can obviously find us on social media like LinkedIn. My name is written here, Theo Tortorici. My co-founder, Rick Radewagen, and my co-founder, Sven Rudolph, are also on LinkedIn. And please, we'd love to talk to you or discuss all these things with you.
All right. Thanks. You're really glad to have you on the show.
Thank you for the thoughtful conversation and the opportunity for sharing more about what we do. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.